Canada just did something that could shake up global oil dynamics, and it's not what anyone saw coming. With pressure building from across the border, the country has decided it's time to switch things up with the U.S. And let's just say, they're not waiting around for a friendly handshake with Trump.
Canada is already responding to President Trump's tariffs on the country with retaliatory tariffs of its own.
As Donald Trump's tariffs cast a huge shadow over the federal election, he also threatened Ottawa and the European Union from working together to do what he calls economic harm to the U.S.
We read in Politico that Ontario Premier Doug Ford threatened to shut off his province's electricity exports to the United States and block shipments of Ontario's high-grade nickel, which he said provides 50% of U.S. supplies. This is per the Globe and Mail.
They say that when one door closes, another one opens, and Canada seems to have found that open door across the Atlantic. While certain powers expected Canada to buckle under pressure, it looks like they've doubled down instead, sending barrels of determination far beyond North America. So, what exactly is Canada doing, and who's going to feel it most? Well, the answer isn't where you'd expect, and the ripple effect might stretch a lot farther than anyone planned. Let's break it all down in this video. As Canada is heading into federal elections on April 28th, both the Liberal and Conservative parties are promising to cut the cord and push Canada toward new global markets. Ever since the U.S. slapped fresh tariffs on Canadian crude oil imports, the usual trade patterns have been flipped on their head. Now, instead of heading south to American refineries, a big chunk of Canada's barrels are setting sail east, straight to Europe. Just take a look at the numbers from March 2025. Seaborne crude exports from Canada skyrocketed to nearly 8 million barrels. That's more than double the monthly average we saw in 2024. With the U.S. market suddenly a lot less attractive, Canadian exporters have been forced to look elsewhere, and Europe wasted no time stepping in. Refiners across the continent, already dealing with shaky supplies from their usual sources and a seasonal spike in demand, were quick to scoop up the redirected oil. The Netherlands and the UK alone took in about 69% of Europe's Canadian crude imports, making Northwest Europe the unofficial new landing zone for these barrels. This rerouting didn't just shift the trade map, it had an immediate ripple effect on the shipping side too. Over in the Mediterranean, freight rates on the TD19 route, that's the 80,000 deadweight ton cross-med run, saw a massive jump. Early March rates were dragging below 150 world-scale points, but they've since surged to 200 WS. That's a 48-point spike in a single day and a weekly gain of 85.39 WS, driven by tighter ship supply and a boom in cross-med activity. Aframax tankers are soaking up most of the action, moving 75.8% of these flows. Their size and agility make them perfect for Europe's port setups, whether it's bringing crude across the Atlantic or moving it around within the continent. With U.S. tariffs still in place and Europe on the hunt for steady supply, this trend doesn't look like it's slowing down anytime soon. And if Canadian oil keeps edging out barrels from West Africa or the Middle East, med freight rates may keep climbing. Both political parties in Canada have even slammed Trump's tariff as unfair and unjust. And voters are responding with a wave of economic nationalism. Now, energy policy is no longer just about pipelines. It's about independence. Alberta, Canada's oil heartland, exports roughly 4.3 million barrels per day of crude to the U.S., along with almost 5 billion cubic feet per day of natural gas. Those flows primarily feed refineries in the Midwest and Gulf Coast, but both parties now want to change that picture, fast. Prime Minister Mark Carney, leader of the Liberal Party, didn't hold back during a March 23rd webcast from Ottawa. He said it was time to fight the Americans and deal head-on with President Donald Trump's tariffs. He pledged to fast-track major energy infrastructure, including projects for both clean and conventional energy, critical minerals, and new trade corridors connecting Canada to reliable global partners. Speaking in Edmonton a day earlier, Carney added that the government's focus is firmly on getting things done in Alberta. He emphasized that the vision includes energy corridors stretching from the oil sands all the way to deepwater Arctic ports in Nunavut. He promised these would be treated as national priorities and executed faster and at a much larger scale than before. Currently, the House of Commons holds 338 seats. The Liberals sit at 152, followed by the Conservatives at 120. The Bloc Québécois has 33, the New Democratic Party holds 24, the Green Party has 2, 3 independents remain, and 4 seats are vacant. On the other side of the aisle, Conservative Party leader Pierre Poilievre is offering bold energy plans of his own. He wants to bring back the scrapped Energy East pipeline, a 1.1 million barrels per day project linking Alberta to the Atlantic coast, and revive the Northern Gateway, a 520,000 barrels per day line that would connect Alberta to the Pacific. Both were previously axed under Liberal leadership. Poilievre also introduced a new concept, Canada Shovel-Ready Zones. These zones, according to his party's website, would be areas already cleared for construction, meaning companies could break ground immediately without waiting on permits. Whether it's a mine, an LNG terminal, or a pipeline, he promised the groundwork would already be done, creating jobs and putting Canada, not the U.S., back in charge of its economy. But opening up new markets isn't as easy as flipping a switch. Greg Stringham, former vice president of markets at the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, pointed out that major hurdles remain, starting with infrastructure. He explained that efficient crude oil markets usually work best when barrels are refined close to their source. Sending Alberta's heavy crude halfway across the globe to Europe or Asia isn't just logistically complex, it's stepping into unfamiliar territory. He warned that Canadian producers would likely be squaring off against big players like Saudi Arabia, who already dominate those markets. And it's not just about competition, it's about time. Stringham noted that building a pipeline all the way from Alberta to New Brunswick would take no less than 3 years. He added that under Liberal leadership since 2015, there's been a track record of dragging out project approvals, which won't help if Canada wants to move quickly. Heather Exner-Pyro, who heads the Natural Resources and Energy Program at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, said there are ways to fast-track things, starting with simplifying the tangled web of regulatory hurdles. She argued that scrapping the current Impact Assessment Act could be a step forward. She also suggested making Indigenous equity more accessible and speeding things up by using what she called a regulatory sandbox, essentially a controlled environment to test and move quicker on big projects. In her view, once a project is officially declared a national priority, all stakeholders, from government to industry, will stop working at arm's length and start acting like a team. How exactly did all of this start? How did Canada go from being the U.S.'s favorite energy supplier to scrambling for new trade routes across the Atlantic and Pacific? To really understand how we got here, we've got to rewind and look at the timeline of the trade war brewing between the U.S. and Canada. February 21st, 2024. On paper, the U.S. and Canada had one of the strongest trade relationships in the world. The numbers said it all. Canada bought more from American businesses than the UK, France, China, and Japan combined. In 2023 alone, the two countries traded a staggering $923 billion in goods and services. The energy and automotive sectors were basically glued together. According to U.S. data cited by congressional researchers, Canada topped the list as America's biggest trading partner, sending $482 billion worth of goods south, while taking in $441 billion in return. That left the U.S. with a $41 billion trade deficit. And even though that deficit grew slightly to $45 billion in 2024, economists from TD Bank pointed out that it was barely a blip, just 4% of America's overall trade deficit. October 15th, 2024. Fast forward to the Economic Club of Chicago, where then presidential candidate Donald Trump laid out his economic strategy during an interview with Bloomberg's John Micklethwaite. His game plan? Use draconian tariffs to bankroll tax cuts and lure manufacturers back to U.S. soil. That speech made it clear. Trump wasn't bluffing. November 25th. Just days later, Trump took to Truth Social to make a bold promise. One of his first executive actions would be to slap a 25% tariff on imports from Canada and Mexico. His reasoning? He accused both countries of failing to secure their borders. November 29th. The shockwaves from that post weren't even done echoing before Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and Finance Minister Dominic LeBlanc found themselves dining at Mar-a-Lago with Trump, U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, and others. On the menu, trade, and how to avoid a full-blown tariff war. December 5th. Backlash was brewing at home, too. The chief economist for the American Farm Bureau Federation urged the U.S. administration to think twice before going after allies like Canada and Mexico. He warned that blindly imposing tariffs could backfire, especially since nearly 20% of U.S. farm sales depend on exports, and Canada and Mexico were two of the industry's biggest customers. December 9th. Then came a headline-grabbing moment. Trump, now president-elect, took a jab at Trudeau, calling him governor of the great state of Canada. Whether it was a joke or a calculated dig, the internet had a field day. December 16th. Back in Ottawa, Canada wasn't waiting to see how things would play out. The Department of Finance rolled out new economic measures in response to the uncertainty brewing post-election, including tariffs on imports from China. It was clear, Canada was gearing up for a storm. Things started getting spicy between Canada and the U.S. on January 6th, when Trump took to Truth Social and confidently and falsely claimed that many people in Canada love being the 51st state. That post didn't land too well. According to polling, 85% of Canadians were against the idea. Trump also said, without evidence, that if Canada became a U.S. state, they'd be totally secure from Russian and Chinese ships surrounding them. In reality, no such thing has ever happened. There have been some sightings of foreign military vessels near Alaska, but nothing like what he described. January 7th, during a press conference at Mar-a-Lago, Trump clarified that he wasn't planning to use military force to absorb Canada, but he did say he'd use economic pressure to get what he wanted. He argued the US-Canada border was a fake line and claimed, again, falsely, that the US was subsidizing Canada to the tune of $200 billion a year through the trade deficit. In truth, the 2024 trade deficit with Canada was around $35.7 billion for goods and services. January 15th, Prime Minister Trudeau gathered Canada's provincial premiers to talk strategy. The US was throwing around tariff threats, and Canada had to figure out how to respond. January 20th, Trump issued a memo directing his officials to assess drug and migration flows from Canada, Mexico, and China, and to recommend trade penalties. By January 22nd, Canadian officials were meeting again, this time to prep for an all-out trade war. One idea: scrapping over 200 interprovincial trade exemptions to make internal Canadian trade smoother. On January 29th, Canadian Foreign Minister Melanie Joly met with U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio in Washington, pushing back against the idea that Canada was some sort of fentanyl superhighway. She said only a tiny percentage of drugs and illegal migrants came through their border. January 31st, Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz called the whole tariff plan a disaster waiting to happen, saying most economists agreed it would hurt both America and the world, and likely spark retaliation. February 1st, Trump kicked off his second term by declaring a national emergency under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA. He slapped 25% tariffs on imports from Canada and Mexico starting March 4th, claiming both nations had failed to help stop drugs at the border. A U.S. government document singled out Canada as playing a central role in that failure. The same day, Trudeau clapped back hard. He unveiled retaliatory tariffs worth 155 billion Canadian dollars, 107 billion US dollars. February 2nd, economists at Royal Bank of Canada said this was the biggest trade shock in nearly a century, comparing it to the Great Depression-era Smoot-Hawley tariffs. February 3rd, Trump blinked slightly and announced a 30-day pause on the Canadian tariffs. That same day, U.S. Customs data revealed only 43 pounds of fentanyl were seized at the Canadian border in 2024. For comparison, 21,100 pounds came through the Mexico border. Canadian border officers reportedly seized more drugs than U.S. officials caught at their northern border. The very next day, February 4th, Trump reversed the pause and said tariffs would start March 4th. That same day, Canada published its own list of retaliatory tariffs. European officials weren't pleased either, calling the tariffs illegal and damaging to global trade. On March 5th, auto industry heavyweights, CEOs from Ford, GM, and Stellantis called Trump directly, begging him to ease up on tariffs that would crush the interconnected supply chain. They warned of price spikes, higher insurance, and job losses. March 6th, the White House issued a fact sheet. Some tariffs would be paused for 30 days, especially for auto parts and energy under USMCA. Potash tariffs were also reduced. Canada responded by postponing its second phase of retaliatory tariffs, but financial markets weren't convinced. Economists and global leaders kept warning that the back and forth was spooking investors, hurting growth, and driving up prices. March 7th, Canada launched the Trade Impact Program, a $6.5 billion Canadian dollar package to support local businesses hit by the tariffs. Another $5 billion Canadian dollars was promised over the next 2 years. News outlets noted how Trump's list of grievances now had little to do with actual trade and more to do with border politics and control narratives. March 9th, Trudeau gave his final speech as Prime Minister, calling the situation an existential crisis for Canada. That same day, Mark Carney won leadership of the Liberal Party in a landslide, becoming Prime Minister designate. He confirmed that he'd keep Trudeau's retaliatory tariffs in place. March 10th, Trump hinted in a Fox News interview that a recession could be coming. Markets freaked out. The S&P 500 lost $4 trillion in value since its peak in February. March 11th, it dropped another 9%, while the Nasdaq tumbled 13%. Trump responded by doubling steel and aluminum tariffs to 50% starting March 12th, allegedly in retaliation for Ontario threatening a 25% tariff on electricity exports to 3 U.S. states. Ontario backed off, but Canada still hit back with $29.8 billion Canadian dollars in countermeasures. Meanwhile, Canada sold off $3.5 billion US dollars in U.S. Treasury bonds. That same day, Trump went back to Truth Social to say, again without proof, that Canada had some of the highest tariffs in the world, especially on U.S. dairy. CNN quickly fact-checked him and pointed out that many of these claims were either gross exaggerations or outright false. March 13th, Canada formally filed a complaint with the WTO, calling the 25% tariffs illegal and a breach of trade rules under the 1994 GATT agreement. March 14th, in his first speech as Prime Minister, Carney said his top priority was protecting Canadian households and workers from what he called unjustified U.S. trade moves. He announced his first overseas trip would be to Europe to strengthen alliances and diversify trade. That same day, Bloomberg reported that it only took 16 days for the S&P 500 to enter correction territory. March 15th, Carney and Defense Minister Bill Blair began reviewing Canada's deal with Lockheed Martin on U.S.-made F-35 jets. Meanwhile, a wave of Canadian patriotism took hold. Consumers were choosing Canadian over American wherever they could. March 17th, Carney met with French President Macron and UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer to talk trade and security. When asked about Trump's 51st state comments, Carney said negotiations wouldn't go further until the disrespect stopped. March 19th, Canada entered advanced talks with the EU on getting preferential access to military contracts. The EU was ramping up defense spending, and 35% of the components could soon come from Canada. That same day, The Economist said, Trump's administration seemed unfazed by the $4.5 trillion US dollars in lost market value, despite economists' warning that consumer spending could take a serious hit. March 28th, Carney and Trump finally spoke on the phone for the first time since Carney became Prime Minister. Carney described the call as positive, cordial, and constructive. Trump also chimed in on Truth Social, saying they had a productive talk and would begin comprehensive negotiations after Canada's upcoming election. Later that day, Trump told reporters that many countries had taken advantage of the U.S., but not Canada. He added, "I think things will work out very well between Canada and the United States."